What is up, good people of the world? Welcome to Score Review Episode 2. I'm incredibly excited to check out Blake's excerpt from an orchestral piece. So this is a nice contrast from the previous episode where he checked out Joey Kostelik's string quartet. This is larger in scale. So we're checking out measures 99 through 114, and the only two things he told me, Blake told me in the email that he sent me is A, that it's meant to be a pirate shanty, a kind of 12/8, 6/8, triple time Irish kind of classic, pirate shanty, and then also that I shouldn't worry too much about critiquing idiomaticism for live players because he's not intending this to be for live players. So I'm assuming it's either going to be sampled or he's fine with the no performer audio. But in any case, so I won't get too anal about those types of things, but I will talk about balance and blend and those types of things. So I'm just as fresh as you when it comes to this piece. I haven't listened to it yet, so let's go ahead and check it out. So we'll start at measure 99, and let's hear what Blake came up with. Very nice, very nice. Okay. Oh, we won't spoil that other stuff. Okay. So let me start out with what I like about this, and then we'll talk about constructive criticism. So first, I think the vibe, the pirate shanty vibe, is perfect, right? The piccolo, which reminds us of like a tin whistle, like in D, with the little dun 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 dun, the little articulations and decorations, gives us that nice kind of like dancing around a fire kind of thing. So I think it's very effective. Harmonically, makes perfect sense. 1 going to 5. Or rather 1, I think if my ears are correct, I think it's 1 going to 2 diminished, and then going to 5, and then going back to 1, which makes perfect sense. And then, 1 tonic, predominant, dominant, and then for the second section, we also have tonic, predominant, dominant, but he uses 4 for the predominant, which gives us this nice minor sound as opposed to the diminished sound. And then rather than returning back to 1, he stays on 5. And that gives us this sense of, what's going to happen. I want to hear the next section. And so it's not overly conclusive, which makes me want to hear what comes next. I think it's all very effective. So there are some, I think, orchestration issues, some balance issues, and some part writing issues that I'm going to point out. So first things first, I think your harpsichord, not that there's anything wrong with what you did, but, it might be nice to try some. The harpsichord, I sort of think of being a kind of, if the flute is to the harp as the oboe is to the harpsichord, right? In some sense, right? The flute has this very sine wavy kind of chill overtone series. The oboe is much more nasal and rich and intense and timbre. And the same thing is true with the harpsichord and the harp. The flute and oboe are both woodwinds. Well, harpsichord and harp are both plucking mechanisms, right? It's a plectrum in the case of the harpsichord. The action is a plectrum, whereas, your actual fingers are plucking in the case of a harp. And you can get a similar sound. Well, first off, most harp strings tend to be made of nowadays nylon, and so it has a more relaxed sort of tone, whereas often harpsichord strings are metallic, similarly to the piano. And also, when you play a harp, it's usually the tip of the pad of your finger, and that's a more relaxed kind of plucking sound. You can use your fingernail if you want and get a more intense sort of sound, but the plectrum mechanism on a harpsichord, is dynamically unforgiving. You don't have a lot of dynamic control on the harpsichord. It tends to be one dynamic level. You can control it a little bit with the action, but not that much. It's just sort of like you press the key down at a certain point, the plectrum just plucks the note, and it's generally going to be the same dynamic level. I know you said you weren't that concerned with writing for live instruments, but it's just something to be aware of. If you have a sample library that's realistic, it doesn't matter how softly or loud you play. It's going to, with some round robin, give you an accurate sense of the consistency of dynamics. That being said, harpsichords often have this little knob that you can pull out. And I actually had the pleasure of performing a couple of period pieces on a harpsichord as a part of the keyboard pedagogy class that I took at Furman, and they have a nice harpsichord there, and it's actually justly in tone, which is really interesting. But anyway, Now, that's a story for another time. The point that I want to make is that with harpsichords, there are often little knobs that you can do that can change the material of the plectrum, which changes the timbre slightly. And there are often two different keyboards with two different sets of strings. Some of them just have one string per note. Some of them have 2 or 3 strings per note. And there also some harpsichords have a horizontally moving action, similarly to a grand piano or nice upright piano soft pedals, where I got to back up here. I don't want to get into too much of a rabbit trail, but this is important information. There's a soft pedal on most pianos, and for cheaper upright pianos, the soft pedal actually just puts down this sort of blanket, this thin piece of cloth, which puts some resistance. Resistance isn't the right word, but the hammer hits the string through the cloth, and that makes the attack significantly less intense, and also quiets the sound. But it's more like a mute in the sense that, yes, while it does make it quiet, it really significantly changes the timbre. Whereas nicer upright pianos and grand pianos actually shift the entire action over horizontally, usually to the left, so that rather than 3 strings per note, there's only 1 string or 2 strings per note. And that essentially, since you're getting less strings per note, it's quieter without changing the timbre as much, right? And this is one of the reasons why pianos out of tune can sound so terrible. It's because the higher strings have 3 strings per note, and so if one gets more out of tune than the others, when you play one note at the piano, you could have 3 different pitches slightly out of tune with one another, which is worse to our ears than just one pitch slightly out of tune. But in any case, I digress. Although I should say quickly, not to get into a whole conversation about this, the reason why that is the case is just dynamic compensation, right? The string section has the same type of artificial dynamic compensation. The lower an instrument is, the larger its body needs to be to resonate, and the larger the wavelengths are, meaning that it's perceived to be louder by our ears. Lower instruments are generally louder. That's why you'll have 1 tuba and 4 trumpets. The best example would be the string section, where you have like 14 to 16 first violins, then maybe like 10 to 12 violas, then maybe like 6 to 8 cellos, and then maybe like 4 double basses. That is natural dynamic compensation. That's one of the reasons why if you just write a chord for the string section and mark them all at the same dynamic level, it's going to balance perfectly, which would not be the case if that's one of the things you have to consider when writing for string quartet, is there isn't that dynamic compensation. The cellist is much more loud in the context of the string quartet than it would be in the context of a cello section amidst a violin section, because there isn't that dynamic compensation. Something to think about. Anyway, that's all to just talk about the harpsichord, and even if you're just writing sample harpsichord, not concerned, just be aware of those things. This, first off, just not to split hairs here, but this hairpin means nothing, right? Because they can't control the loudness of the volume, and maybe you just copied and pasted it from the other instruments and you didn't think about that, and so that's fine, but the hairpin means nothing, right? And if you want to do mezzo forte as opposed to forte, they can control that a little bit, again, by changing the action, but you can't actually control velocity on the harpsichord. And if you're playing on a harpsichord sample patch, I think it's generally a good idea to not have that artificial velocity sensitivity on, where normally if I play like a staccato, like pizzicato, for example. Well, there are when you're sampling, there are 2 kinds of velocity control. One is with the mod wheel, because if I'm playing, if I am playing the melodica, once I press the key, I can't, unless I'm on a Rolly C board, I can't give the MIDI controller any more information about dynamics. It's only the initial attack where I can press it softly or loudly, of course, the 0 to 127 being the different gradations of velocity sensitivity in general MIDI. So that's why with true legato instruments, true legato samples, you have to use the mod wheel to control, because with the mod wheel you can control the dynamic after you press the note, just like you can control the dynamic after you start playing a note with wind instruments and string instruments in a way that you can't with the piano or harpsichord. Once you pressed it, you can't control it. All you can do is control the attack and release, but not the sustain. But in any case, sometimes harpsichord sample libraries put artificial velocity sensitivity, but rather than if you play softly, it's actually playing an audio file of the harpsichord playing more softly. It just plays the same audio file, but it just turns down the volume fader, which sounds a little bit artificial, and it doesn't give you the harpsichord, the true vibe of the harpsichord, which is like you play a chord and every note is exactly the same volume. Some people think that that's to the detriment of the harpsichord, but that's a part of the aesthetic of the harpsichord. That's also to say, well, another point about the harpsichord I was going to say is that, I think it would sound more both in the style of a sea shanty and also a bit more idiomatic and contribute to the texture more to have like, larger chords that are arpeggiated, you know. That just has a bit more of that authentic sort of basso continuo harpsichord playing continuo kind of sound, that in the Baroque period those jigs often would have. Again, you can check out any of Bach's. Like, I think the third movement of Bach's A minor violin concerto is a good example of a very effective sea shanty jig. And the harpsichord is always there playing those notes in the backward, and they hardly ever just play chords down. They often will arpeggiate them, similarly to the way that harp does. Anyway, so just something just wanted to point out that those dynamic considerations with regards to the harpsichord, and also point out that I think having arpeggiated chords might be something that might be nicer. I don't know what the Celeste is doing here, because that's completely out of range and can't be played by the Celeste down there. Even if you wrote up in the upper register, the Celeste tends to be really, really quiet, and again, you could up it in your mix, but I don't think the Celeste in the low register, which tends to be really overtony, similar to the 2-liter bells, will contribute particularly well to this texture. I do like the fact that Blake has rhythmic vitality and sort of more legato harmonization. I think too often people do one or the other. They're like, oh, everyone's doing eighth notes, or everyone's playing half notes or whole notes. And the former is really excited and has a lot of energy and pulsation, but it feels lacking in richness, and it's thin. Whereas, obviously, if you just have whole notes and half notes, then there's a lack of rhythmic vitality. And so I think having both of those can be very, very effective, and I think Blake has done that well. Bass flute is an incredibly quiet instrument, and it's just never going to be heard ever. And even if you turn it up enough artificially in the mix, I think it's going to create acoustic discrepancy problems, and so I don't think bass flute is useful here at all. If you want this, that would be great in the register of the bassoon. It'd be great in the register of the bass clarinets, but just I don't think bass flute is going to contribute to this texture at all. It's a very, very delicate instrument. A good example of well-used bass flute would be in Mercury, and I think also in, not Mercury, Neptune, and also Venus. The two slow movements of Holt's The Planets, he uses bass flute. And in very, very delicate textures, it can be very, very effective in a lovely tone, but I don't think it's appropriate in this context. When the piccolo gets to down this lower register, like especially around here, I mean, I think all of this is fine. This is all going to be heard, right? And you've marked them up to triple F, although I think it's a little overkill. I think you should bring other instruments down rather than pushing the piccolo up to that extreme. Because if you're, and again, I know like I can throw out to some extent like live players, but like ultimately I'm a person who is concerned about writing for live players, and even when you're writing for samples, samples are still recorded from real instruments, and so I think it's important to consider at least dynamic balance and things like this. But the piccolo in this lower register, just like the flute, when you get down off the ledger lines, it really loses a lot of power. And even in Note Performer right now, you can't really hear it in those lower tones. And so you could easily create some sort of composite, right? So first things first, I actually think all of this could be played very effectively by the flute. And none of it is that high. Right? It's a little dodgy up there, and you'd have to have a good flautist, but if you're writing for samples, it's not an issue. But that's like in prime territory for the flute. Any higher, it'd be too high, but that's going to come across way better than the piccolo, right? You also could do a dovetailing where piccolo plays the top note, flutes play the low note. Bop, boom, bop, 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 bop. You could split them apart. And of course, once you get back to this upper register, you can switch back to the piccolo. But yeah, just be aware that anytime you're writing for any flute instrument, if you start going down in the ledger lines is where they're most comfortable, and they gain a lot of power up there. And of course, the double reeds are the opposite. The double reeds have power in the lower register and get thin as they go up. So that's an important asymmetry to realize with regards to dynamics. So the other comment that I have is, while the harmony makes sense functionally, I think it sounds particularly thin because of the fact that you have the melody and bass line playing the exact same thing in octaves, right? In a very, very kind of powerful texture, That can sometimes be effective. Melody and bass line are playing the same thing, and then parts in the middle. That's sort of like kind of like a sax soli sound for a jazz band, or like a piano technique where you have octaves but harmony in the middle. But in this context, splayed across the orchestra and etude, I just think it really makes it sound thin. Like I wish that your bass line was more complementary to your melody intervallically. I mean, and this is one of the first things that they teach in like counterpoint and part writing, is to have nice, good counterpoint between outer voices. So rather than having melody and we'll do it in the key that it's there, it's A minor. Rather than having melody and bass line doing, sorry, that's A is super out of tune. But you could do something like this. Right? They're both very, very, very effective, right? But in the case of the second example, you get 6 and thirds between outer voices, and they're complementing each other, right? If they're both playing the same line, it just sort of shoots up, locks into this octave, and it sounds really, really thin, right? And so I would advocate for having non-octave intervals between outer voices, or at least not parallel octaves. And I think, again, the issue is not because of the parallelism. It's not because of like, oh, let's avoid parallelism to have independence of parts, because I don't think that's that important here. I think it's more important to realize that having outer voices playing octaves just makes it sound really thin, right? And it makes it sound like they're not harmoniously complementing one another, like, they're both sort of doing the same job redundantly. So I would highly recommend having that type of a, that type of a setup. And then the other thing that I would say regarding this, so here's an example of like fundamental part writing, right? So let's say I have like A minor, right? Well, first things first, if I'm going to go to 2, right, you can make a decision about whether or not you want to have root position 2 or first inversion 2. But I will say, not that you have to be, super accurate to the Baroque period, but you're writing something in that style, and so they hardly ever went to 2 in root position. A, because it gives you this sort of parallelism, it's an adjacent chord relationship, and B, because then you'd have a tritone between outer voices, whereas if it's in first inversion, let's say like B diminished in first inversion, the tritone is between upper voices, but you get consonances between the outer voices. And it just makes for a nicer 1-4-5 kind of harmonic bass line. And so, if I'm going from A minor, to 2, what's most common is to have this type of a thing, So you could either go to this, or you could double, the, what am I trying to say? The third of the chord, which is most common, or you could do half diminished. So here's half diminished, right? Excuse me. Right, which normally goes to 5, and third inversion with a D in the bass, and then resolves down to A minor over C, right? Or you could, and I should pull this up, I should pull up the keyboard so you can actually see what I'm doing. So here is the first kind of fundamental part writing. Right, so that's if you want to go to 1 and first inversion, which is actually great in the sense that it doesn't sound particularly final. This is another thing that I think people often misunderstand about the classical period. People would try to write music that's like 1-5, 1-5, 1, and they always do root position 1-5, 1-5. But if you look at like Mozart and Bach and those classical, I know one's Baroque and one's classical, but if you look at like that common practice period area of music, they rarely used, most of the time that they used root position 5 going to root position 1 is at cadences, right? But in the middle, it's constantly like, rather than E major going right back to A minor, E major, E over D, right, then A minor over C. Those inverted chords give you the sense of, yeah, you're resolving 5-1, but it's not the final 5-1. You save the final 5-1 for the ending of that section, or the ending of the piece. But the other thing that I was going to say is, if you didn't want 2 half diminished, well, then the thing that you would do is you could have that same melody that you have going here, but then E would go down to D, right? And then 1D would stay the same. In this case, there's some voice crossing, and 1D would stay the same. It would become the dominant 7th of E dominant 7 and then resolve down, and then the other one would move up, right? And then this B would go down to this, right? And then that would resolve. That would resolve like that, right? And then so it's up to you whether or not you want to make those decisions. And so right here, you know, you could also voice it so that it's open voicing or closed voicing, and I don't want to like derail into a harmony lesson here, but all that I'm saying is that having outer voices playing octaves makes it sound really, really thin, and since you're using conventional progressions like 1, you know, 2 diminished, 5, 1, 1, 4, 5, 1, it might be helpful to open up a music theory manual and just review the sort of standard voice leadings for those things, and there's not really a reason to violate it unless you have a specific good reason for violating it, because, you know, it sounds, it's like, don't reinvent the wheel, you know. If you're staying in the realm of cars, there's no need to reinvent the wheel because the wheel's already been perfected. So that's true with these types of fundamental progressions. Anyway, I digress. Sorry for that little digression there. So the only other, so there's a dynamic balance problem with the piccolo. The outer voices playing octave sounds thin. And then the only other thing that I would say, and harpsichord having those pluck types of things. I like the you know, percussion that you have going. Although I would say you could have a little bit more variety, because remember, like if there's a minstrel playing a jig or something like this, they're going to be playing bum ba dum ba dum ba da ba da bum ba da ba ba bum. You know, there's an idiom, and they stick to the idiom, but there's embellishments on top of the idiom. Just like, you know, the beginning drummer plays a swing rhythm, ting 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 ting, right? But a real jazz drummer is going to play ting 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 ting, right? Mostly the idiom, but there's some embellishment within a kind of general framework. And I think your percussion, it's sort of boring and annoying to kind of notate that stuff in Sibelius. But when I create percussion in this type of, you know, fashion for world music, I always do that stuff in the DAW. I don't worry about notating that stuff, you know, at all. I just pull out my Korg Nano pad, you know, assign bongos and different things to the different pads, and just mess around with different things, and I will perform a percussion performance that's human and has some, you know, slight variability, rather than just creating one loop and then looping it over and over again. I think that's another thing that separates amateur kind of video game and film kind of world tracks from professional tracks, is that the professionals often will hire authentic percussionists who will add their own you know, percussion on top of that. And obviously, you know, you can't replace someone who studied this kind of, you know, percussion accompaniment for the entire life, but I think if you can perform, if you can get a sense of, you know, performing percussion on keyboard, and if you can do that yourself, then that gives it that extra level of human quality and makes it sound like there's an actual percussionist playing, rather than just like you have a loop that's looping over and over and over again. Yeah, and another thing I was going to talk about is the voicing. I appreciate the fact that, you know, viola, cello, and contrabass are playing those repeated notes, and then you know, bassoons are holding down the fort, but then the same thing is true in reverse. You know, first and second violins are playing the longer tones. Well, first off, I don't know whether or not you actually need those longer tones, because I think that sort of distracts from the upper level melody stuff. I think you could have harmony just exist in the mid to upper mid register. I don't think you need to have those high string chords. And I'm not sure that I'm a fan of how it's differentiated. I would probably personally just keep the strings playing the rhythms and the winds playing harmony, or vice versa. When you mix things up, especially in the midst of the attention being focused on the piccolo melody, that just seems a little bit hair-splitting. I think these arpeggiatic configurations are fine. It works nicely with the harmonization. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's just, you know, it's just adding an extra layer of movement. I think that's perfectly fine. And also realize that, you know, you also could double the piccolo down an octave with flute or with oboe if the register works out, and, you know, you can still dynamically, that allows that. The difficulty with any soloist, especially woodwind soloist, accompanied by the full orchestra, is just that soloist coming out of the texture, right? And this goes back to, you know, a conversation about orchestration. I really think there are 4 different kinds of orchestral textures, and each one has a totally different methodology. There's choir writing, which I don't mean writing for voices, but I mean like writing for a specific section, writing just for brass, writing just for strings, writing just for a specific family of woodwinds, double reeds, single reeds, or flutes. And that's the easiest to write because, you know, since you're writing all in the same family, things automatically balance, and there's a similarity of idiomaticism. And then there's 2D writing, which is essentially just everyone playing at once. And you'd think that'd be the most complicated, but it's actually not, because there are only so many ways that you can balance everyone playing at once. And if you study a bunch of the greatest tutti climaxes of orchestral pieces, you'll find that there aren't that many different kinds of textures that work well like that. And so it's, it's something that you can turn into an algorithm to some extent, and another reinvent the wheel thing. And then there's composite orchestration, which I think is probably the most difficult. That's what I like to do most of the time, mixing and mingling different instruments together, where you really have to understand balance and blend. And then finally, there's accompanying a soloist, right? And with accompanying a soloist, the biggest issue is balance, right? Not letting the soloist get drowned out by the orchestra. And so there's nothing wrong with having the orchestra be significantly lower in volume and also bringing the orchestra up. Again, like 2 examples of this. One, Schindler's List. If you look at the score for Schindler's List, John Williams has the violin marked at forte, mezzo forte, like the whole piece, and the strings are marked at like P, 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 the whole piece, right? There's a huge discrepancy there, and that's why Schindler's List can be performed by a live orchestra without microphone or electronic reconstruction and sound perfectly balanced. It's because, and this is the same thing with concerti, right? If you want to study how to write for a soloist, study a concerti. That's why I think... I don't know whether or not I mentioned this before in this episode, but if I did, forgive me. But check out Bach's Gigue from his A minor violin concerto, the 3rd movement. That's a wonderful. And that also has harpsichord and some great harmony that still stays in the idiom, but is very creative. That's a lovely piece. I think a good model to check out for writing this piece of music. And how to accompany a soloist. And generally the piccolo and its higher register can pop out of the texture quite nicely. You see this in Sousa marches, for example, where the piccolo just plays this lovely high little line, and it just slices right through. But it only really slices when you're in the ledger lines, right? When you start getting in this territory, it really quickly loses a lot of power, so just be aware of that. And I think there's not anything wrong with doing significant dynamic compensation, like especially for these upper strings. I don't think they need to be forte, mezzo, forte. I think they could be mezzo, piano, mezzo, forte, and that would help out. That would help out things. I also wish that your melody had a little bit more space in it. Like it has some nice space here, which is fine, but over here it's a little bit run on. Again, if you listen to like Bach's A minor violin, he has these really nice like incessant modo perpetua, perpetual motion kind of lines, but he has breaks like right? So it's mostly motion, but you can all sing it on one breath. And so this strikes me as fine in the sense that you have these little breaks here, which is cool. But this strikes me as a little bit run on. And I know to some extent the piccolo is kind of joining the accompanimental figuration and then returning to play the melody, but I think I would be clear about whether or not you want it to sound like it's the melody, or if it's the accompanimental figuration, then maybe it can, another instrument can take over there, and you could just drop the piccolo out and then have the piccolo come in when it goes back to playing the melody. So yeah, I think I already said this, but bass flute is not going to contribute at all in this texture because bass flute is very, very quiet. Other than that, I think it's pretty effective. Avoid low intervals that are, I don't know if you've ever heard of the low interval limit, Blake, but instruments that have more intense, so to the extent that an instrument has an intense overtone series, the intervals that occur later in the overtone series sound muddy when you're down low, and I've talked about this many times before, so you can just look up low interval limit, but, that sounds really muddy, right? That's going to sound really, really muddy in real life. You're not really going to hear those pitches. And so I would opt, in the lower registers, you just want to have mostly octaves and fifths. Save the thirds and sixths for mid to high register instruments. And I think as long as you differentiate, as long as you follow the low interval limit, as long as you balance and blend low, and as long as you differentiate ideas according to frequency registers or articulations or timbres, then that's fine. So I think you have the meat and potatoes here. I think you've got the vibe right. You've got the general chord choice harmonic structures, and the melody has a nice contour to it. I think just, again, in summation, give the melody a little bit more space, improve the complementary intervals between the outer voices in your part writing. And again, that's something you can check out in any standard music theory textbook, because what you're writing is square in the idiom of the Baroque jig. And then understand how the dynamics of the harpsichord works, and consider the subjective suggestion of having the harpsichord arpeggiating similarly to the way that a harp does. I also am not sure that you need to have all of these arpeggiatic configurations. Like if you have guitar and piano and clarinet, those are 3 different timbres, and so I always like to use this example with the complementary colors. If you combine like the 3 primary colors together, well, if you combine 2 primary colors together, you get this nice vivid color. Yellow and blue is green, red and blue is purple, right? Any 2 colors you combine, you get a nice quality, right? But if you combine together all 3 of the primary colors, then you get this, really dull sort of color. And I think it's similar with orchestration. This gets into a conversation about exposed versus doubled orchestration, and I'll probably do a video on that at some point. But in any case, I like to combine no more than 2 different families of instruments simultaneously in exposed sections. Any more than that, and you just lose the individuality of the instruments, and it just sort of turns into this gray wash of sound like an organ. Unless that's what you're going for, like the Bruckner blocks of sound, or if you just want everyone going at once in a tutti, that's another thing. But for kind of more composite orchestrations like this, I would advocate for choosing a limited number of instruments to double the same thing, and doing so in a way that they complement one another. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about that. As always, Blake and also anyone else, let me know if you have any comments about any of or questions about any of my feedback in the comment section. So I really enjoyed listening to this. It's a nice raucous romp, and I look forward to the second episode. And I guess I'll go ahead and play it one more time just so you can hear it. 2 more comments that I thought of. One, anytime you have a hairpin this long, just write the word crescendo. I know it's not going to play back in Sibelius, and I know you're not concerned with live players, but you don't need this long of a really long hairpin like that. Just looks unseemly to the eye, and it's better to just write the word C-R-E-S-E, period. There's something else I was going to say. Right now, also, like it just seems like it's just bam, 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 bam for all 16 bars. So I wish there was a little bit more. I wish it doesn't have to be that dramatic, but again, Bach is a good person to check out for this. Having those kinds of dynamic twists and turns, keeps your attention. If it's just this block of forte for 16 bars, it desensitizes the ear a little bit. And the other thing that I was going to say is when you have breaks in your melody, I would rather, again, have the strings playing quietly in the background, and then when your melody stops for a second, then bring out a counter line, right? And there can be no clearer example of this than in big band music, where you have singers singing, and when the singer is singing, just the rhythm section is playing, right? Just piano, comping, bass in the background, and maybe guitar and maybe drums, and just accompanying the singer. And when the singer hits a note and chills out for a second, or when the singer stops, then the big band comes in and goes bum bow. Then the singer keeps singing, right? If the big band played on top, if the horns played on top of the singer, you would not be able to hear them the singer would quickly get drowned out. And so listening also to like classic big band arrangements like the Nat King Cole album Unforgettable, and also like all the classic Frank Sinatra standards, and even more modern examples would be some of the Michael Bublé albums, which are very well arranged. I think that point about allowing the accompaniment to be very, very supportive, and then comment when the melody is not playing and have a kind of conversation, and then go back to being quiet. I think that's an abstract principle that can apply across, anytime you have a melody and accompaniment texture, not just in the jazz idiom. Anyway, that's it for this episode. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in the next episode. Adios.